I never believed in ghosts before I moved into my sorority's main house, my junior year of college. It was an 8-bedroom, stone house that had been built in the early 1800s. It had been a family home for decades, but at one point in the 70s and 80s was used as a small nursing home and terminal care facility. It was a beautiful house, almost a mansion really, with beautiful woodwork and glass doors separating each main room downstairs, and a large foyer. All of the bedrooms lined a long hallway upstairs. The girls that had lived there before us always had creepy ghost stories to tell, and they believed the ghosts of the families that had lived there, and the patients who died there, had stuck around. I never really believed any of it. It didn't take me very long at all to change my tune. The first experience happened around in July. We were moving in before the school year started. I came down with my boyfriend Mark to paint and prep my room. My sorority sister Sarah also came down to stay the night and hang out. We were the only 3 in the house that night. Mark and I had painted all day and decided to sleep in the pull-out in the living room, while Sarah headed up to her room. We couldn't sleep, and lay there talking for an hour or so. We had the lights on in the foyer, and they blinked on and off a few times in rapid succession. I said something like, "Well, that's strange. Maybe the wiring is loose? Or it's the ghosts," with a little chuckle. Mark, being a 250-pound, muscle-bound fraidy cat, practically whispers, "This place gives me the creeps. I want to sleep in my truck." Immediately after that little exchange, the glass door between the living room and the foyer started to rattle. And I mean, not like a little breeze rattle, more like violently shaking in its frame for about 30 seconds, then stopped. We both froze in fear, and I discovered for the first time that if I'm really scared, I start to giggle hysterically. This, of course, freaked Mark out even more, and to the truck he sprinted. We did eventually come back inside that night, and nothing more happened, but we definitely didn't sleep much. The next morning we told Sarah, who had slept fine and had not heard anything of what had gone downstairs the night before. So, that was my official welcome to the haunted sorority house. The other experience happened during the beer bash fall, which passed by without too much ghostly activity. The other sisters moved in, we set about starting our year. In the fall, we always held a large beer bash to help recruit new members. The morning after the beer bash, the house was an absolute disaster, beer cans everywhere. All 8 of us were sitting around the dining room table, nursing our hangovers and eating some breakfast before we began cleaning up. Suddenly from upstairs we heard a loud crash. We went up and discovered that a glass candle holder had flung itself from its spot on the shelf in the bathroom, flown about 10 feet, and smashed into the bathroom door, exploding glass shards everywhere. No one had a reasonable explanation. If it was a ghost, it was easy to figure out that they were none too happy about our party the night before. Other random stuff, it was around this time that we started noticing other unexplainable things that were happening around the house. Often, if we were all downstairs, we would hear muffled voices, footsteps, and doors opening and shutting down upstairs. If we went up to investigate, nothing would be there. If all of us were in our bedrooms, we would often hear the same things happening downstairs. Lights continued to turn on and off, and one of my housemates claimed to see a shadow of a man on the dining room wall. So I downloaded that Ghost Radar app a while ago, like a few iPhones ago. Now if you aren't familiar with it, it's meant to post words that the ghosts could be saying, and showing where in your house or wherever they could be via a little map thing. Total bullshit, right? Well, first off, I want to say when you download any app, you have to allow permissions to the app to access anything like photos, voice, etc. So that can't be an issue in this. Well, I turned it on in my living room, and then a few seconds later, it kept saying, "Daniel, Daniel, Daniel." My uncle Dan had died a few weeks prior to this, but he hated being called Daniel. So I thought it was just a coincidence. So I said out loud, "Clearly it's not you because you know you hate that name." Then it started saying, "Dan, Dan, Dan." So still not convinced, I was like, whatever, and shut it off. Then I was babysitting my nephew, and he was obsessed with the Rocky films. I called him Rocky as a nickname. I turned the app on and it says, "Rocky," straight away. Of all words? Then the day my dog died, I sat outside of my backyard and looked at his little grave my dad dug. He buried him in this flower bed thing he had made in the group. And to take my mind off it, I opened the Ghost app. The first thing it says is dog. And then it says Billy, which was my dog's name. I don't have an iPhone anymore, so I haven't used the app in a really long time. But I just found these answers so strange. Sure, it could be totally a coincidence, but 3 times in a row and it's exactly right? I don't know, just so strange to me. I've had a lot of experience with the paranormal since I was about 16 years old, and I'd like to share one of my more memorable experiences. When I was about 20, my dad, who was a mechanic, got me a GMC Jimmy. I never had a new car, and this was no different. I'm not sure how old it was because it was basically a mishmash of different SUVs. The glove compartment said it was a Bronco, but the frame said it was a GMC, and I assumed it had been some sort of accident if the frame inside and inside were different. I asked my dad, but he said he got it in an auction, so we didn't really know the history of it. I drove it for a few weeks and had no problems. I thought it was pretty good for a beater SUV, and took the time to clean it inside and out. After a few weeks, I remember driving home from one of my jobs. I worked at Starbucks and was a lifeguard at a few different pools, and looked in the rearview mirror. I saw a kid, maybe about 7 or 8 years old, with bright orange hair and a bowl cut, sitting right behind me in the center of the back seat. He was smiling and had a small gap in between his teeth. I turned around to look, and he wasn't there. I turned back around to look at the rearview mirror, and it fell off. I pulled over because it was on the highway, and looked around, but didn't see anyone. I tried sticking the mirror back up, but it wouldn't stay. I ended up going to get some glue for the rearview mirror at an auto parts store right after, but no matter what I did, it wouldn't stick back on. I told my dad it had fallen off, and he finally got it to stay on after messing with it for a while. I was understandably wary after that, and kept checking behind me periodically in the rearview mirror, but nothing happened for a few days. One afternoon, I was driving home from lifeguarding, and my driver's side window just fell into the door. I told my dad, and he fixed it, even though at that point I was uncomfortable driving the SUV because of what I had seen. I figured maybe it would have some problems since it was older, so I didn't associate the kid with the problems. My dad fixed the window. The next night I was driving home at around 11 p.m. after lifeguarding, and my gas pedal fell off. I almost wrecked the SUV because it happened just as I was passing some construction, and the lane had shifted due to a path made by road cones. There was a police car behind me, and they pulled me over, probably thinking I was drunk. When they came up to my window, they saw me, and asked what happened. I showed them the gas pedal, and they kind of laughed and told me to get it fixed. I told my dad what had happened when I got home, and he said that even though the SUV was kind of old, it shouldn't be falling apart like it was. I didn't tell him about the kid I saw, because I kind of felt like maybe he wouldn't believe me. About a week later, I was driving down the highway to get to work, and the brakes wouldn't work. I pressed down and nothing happened. I was pretty freaked out, but just let off the gas and steered the SUV to the side of the road. I got it stopped, then walked to a payphone to call my dad. He got there and checked the brake line, and said there was no brake fluid in it. At that point I was done. In my mind, even if it had nothing to do with that kid, I felt like I was too unsafe to drive. My dad replaced the brakes in the brake system, and drove it for a week or so. Told me he had no problems with anything, and said it would be okay to drive. I couldn't tell him that I didn't want to drive it, because I didn't want to have to explain why, so even though I didn't want to, I drove it to work. The brakes failed again. It was the same thing. I got my dad to look at the brakes and he said the brake fluid was completely gone, but he couldn't find anything wrong. At that point, he said he didn't want me driving it because he was afraid that I'd get into an accident. We parked it at our house and let it sit there for a couple of days. My dad said he was going to talk it over with his friend who was also a mechanic, and decide what to do with it. After a couple of days, I was sitting in our kitchen, eating lunch, and my dad and brother walked in the house. My brother asked my dad if he had ever seen a kid with red hair in the SUV. My dad said, "With a bowl cut?" I was so surprised, and I just looked at them and said, "Yeah, he's about 7 or 8 years old." We all talked about what we had seen. My dad figured that maybe a kid had died in the SUV and that was why we'd all seen him at some point. We had all seen the kid in the same spot, in the center of the back seat, smiling. We'd all seen him at a glance, but when we looked back, he would be gone. My dad had seen him when he was driving the SUV around after the brakes had failed the first time. My brother had seen him when he was walking by the SUV to come inside the house. My dad never said anything, but I think maybe after we talked, he thought all the weird stuff that had happened in the SUV had something to do with that kid. I told my friend who worked at Starbucks, and she said that she wanted to see the SUV. My dad had gone to visit our relatives in Florida. My brother was living at my aunt's house, so she and I went over to my house to go look at it. My friend has had a lot of experiences with the paranormal too, so I figured she'd be able to see the kid if he was there. We had spent the day at her house, so we went over there at about 11:30 p.m. She pulled into our neighbor's driveway across the street, so we could watch the SUV. We didn't see anything, so we just sat there, talking about what had happened with the SUV. I remember not looking at the SUV the whole time because I felt uneasy looking at it. We both looked at the SUV at the same time at one point, and we both saw the kid sitting in the back seat, right in the center. It's so surreal to think about it now, but it was just as surreal back then. I thought it was just a person just sitting there, because the headlights on my friend's car were shining off the back of the kid's neck. He wasn't moving or anything, just staring straight ahead. I felt like I couldn't move, like I was paralyzed. And then the kid's head started to turn to the right, and my friend peeled out of there. I remember my head hitting the headrest. She hit the gas so hard. We didn't really talk about what had happened. I guess because it was so scary, that's just one of those things you don't want to discuss. You just want to forget that it ever happened. I stayed at my friend's house until my dad came back from Florida. When my dad came back, I told him what my friend and I had seen. They needed to get rid of the SUV. I just didn't want to have anything to do with it after that. I never did find anything in the news about a kid with orange or red hair who was about 7 or 8 years old and had been in an accident. I'm not sure who my dad gave the SUV to, and I never asked. Before I begin, I personally ask that the skeptics stay out of this post. I'm actually genuinely terrified and believe without a doubt I'm being haunted. I would love professional opinions on how to fix this. I've always had an interest in the paranormal, enjoyed horror films, read up on paranormal investigators, etc. 3 days ago, I would have never believed what was going to happen to me. It started as an ordinary lunch with my parents. After we finished our meal, we decided to visit the Barnes & Noble's bookstore across the street. I was raised in a Christian family, and had been told time and time again to stay away from black magic and demon history. I never took the warning too seriously, because while I do fully believe now, there was a slim doubt beforehand that kept me searching for some real truth. And then I found it in the religion section, The Black Arts, by Richard Cavendish, a condensed history of witchcraft, demonology, astrology, alchemy, and other mystical practices throughout the ages. It seemed like a very interesting read. I was almost pulled to it in some way. The moment I saw it, I wanted it. I wanted to indulge myself in this dark history. There was something eerie about this feeling, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Looking back, I now believe it was a warning. Maybe the book was signaling me not to get involved unless I truly wanted to, like, there's no turning back. Almost without a thought, I grabbed the book and flipped to the table of contents. Demons, sacrifices, spells, religion. It was a book compiled of everything I've always wanted to know about. So I began reading, starting at the very beginning. I encourage no one to read this book. It's darker than I would have ever imagined, written by someone who clearly wants to see the fall of the common man. I don't even want to repeat any of the vile things discovered in just the short 15-minute increment I spent reading. But at the time, I didn't recognize this. I loved every second of it. I almost questioned how I had lived 21 years without knowing any of these things. I immediately accepted it all as fact, and even now I still do. These things are real, and I urge you not to even read these passages digitally. The true problem came when my parents approached me and told me they'd like to leave. They had offered to drive and pay for lunch that day, so I didn't bring my wallet along. Now, even though I've more or less fallen away from the church a tad, my parents are still highly involved. Unable to pay for the book myself, I begged them to buy it, but they refused. Trust me, I tried as hard as I could, even considered stealing it, but that's not the man I am. I decided I'd hide it on another shelf and come back for it. The moment I turned my back to the shelf I placed it on, I was repulsed, sickened by the thought of wanting it and reading any of it. I still can't explain the sudden mood swing, but I had no intention to return and retrieve it after I left. When nightfall came the first night, it's when I first noticed something strange. My dog did nothing but stare at me all night, and this is the most out-of-control pup you'd ever meet. Never sits still. I work as a veterinary technician, so I know his behavior is out of place. I run a quick checkup on him, and nothing seems abnormal. When I put him back down, he continues to stare at me. No growling, not a single noise, just a cold, blank stare. This may not frighten anyone just reading it, but it made me very uneasy, and it only got worse. The next morning I woke up with a tooth missing its filling I'd put in at least a decade ago. I read on Google that fillings are known to fall out after a while, so it didn't worry me, until I looked at the tooth in the mirror. Jet black. In case you don't know anything about the anatomy of the human mouth, A tooth dying and turning jet black overnight is utterly impossible. I called the dentist to see if they could get me in. They set an appointment for the afternoon. When I arrived, they took a quick x-ray and sat me in a chair. My dentist told me that I did in fact lose my filling, but began laughing the moment I asked, "Why is it black?" She held up a mirror. It wasn't black. It was back to normal. I promised her I wasn't seeing things. She tried to convince me it was the lighting, but I swear to you that's impossible. This was as dark as black can get. She refilled my tooth and let me on my way. Confused and stressed, I got home and decided to nap on my couch. I awoke in a sweat, to my TV on, and my dog abnormally staring at me once again. And that's when I noticed the strangest thing yet. New filling, gone. Tooth once again jet black. This is probably the first time I began to freak out. I called the dentist. Closed. Being as superstitious as I am, I got super paranoid. I think back to the book, wondering if it could have anything to do with these strange occurrences. Before I can convince myself that it's too good to be true, I get a phone call. I don't recognize the number. When I answer, I'm told it's Laura, from Barnes & Noble. I cannot express with words the amount of fear that immediately overcame me. The employee tells me my order has arrived and is ready for pickup. You can guess what it was. A book. The book. After some debating, I decided to pick it up. I figured maybe I could find a passage that could help me or figure out who sent it to me. I don't even bring it to the car. I open the box in the store. Sure enough, the book is there. I pull out the receipt to check for a name. I have no luck. That's when I notice a piece of paper peeking out from behind the front cover. I pull it out and it reads, "You pledged. Wicca." You're caught up now. I received the book yesterday. My tooth is black, my dog is staring, and no matter where I place the book in my home, I return to find the cover open, every time. Please tell me what I did or what is happening to me. I'm too terrified to search anything related to the word Wicca. Am I safe? What do I do with this book? Please help me. I have no idea how to get rid of whatever evil has surrounded me. I attended college in Savannah, Georgia, and during my senior year I lived in an old apartment. I've always been intrigued by the paranormal, but I'm not one to immediately cry ghost at the first sight of something strange. I always try to find the most logical solution immediately, since usually when something paranormal happens, my first thoughts are rarely, "Oh my, must be a ghost." But then again, this was Savannah, a city built on its dead. The first few times I realized there was something going on was when I would be working alone in one of the front rooms of the apartment. The apartment was set up so when you walked in there were two huge rooms that could be separated with giant wooden sliding doors. Back in the day, the owner of the house would have dinner parties at the end of the night. The men would go into one room and smoke cigars, while the women would go into the other room and gossip and whatnot, and the doors would be closed. I would work in the second room, and if I'm recalling correctly from the many historic tours, that would be the men's parlor. So one night I was up late working, when I heard footsteps slowly walking up behind me. The old wooden floors creaked, and I could even feel the vibrations as they got closer. Thinking my roommate had somehow come home without me noticing, I turned to greet her, and of course, no one was there. I brushed it off thinking it was my imagination and continued working. A couple minutes later it happened again, and it continued for the rest of the night. I started freaking out, thinking the next time I turn around I'd actually see something, so I went to bed. After a couple more nights of this, I eventually stopped working in the living room late at night. The next thing happened when I walked into the kitchen one day. I kept a small bowl of corks on top of the fridge. I was collecting for a do-it-yourself cork board, and I walked through the doorway when a cork came flying across the kitchen at me. I had no idea what to think, and in shock, I turned and walked out. A couple days later, the same thing happened again. One night I was laying in the bed on my phone. Next to my bed was a wall outlet that had a lamp and my phone charger plugged into it. I just made the decision to plug the phone in and go to sleep, and just as I looked up I watched as the phone charger flew out of the wall outlet and went flying across the room. I stared in disbelief and tried to chalk it up to maybe a power surge, but the lamp had not flickered, and it was still plugged in. I flipped over, faced the wall, threw the covers over my head, and slept with the lights on that night. One weekend my roommate threw a birthday party for one of her friends at the apartment. It was strange for me since I didn't know anyone in my own home, so I just awkwardly hung out in the kitchen. At one point in the night, this girl came up to me and said, "I don't know if you know this, but you have the spirit of a 13-year-old boy in here and in your room. He likes to play tricks." I was shocked. I hadn't mentioned anything about the flying corks or chargers that night or to anyone but my boyfriend at the time. She said she hadn't meant to be rude, but my bedroom door was open as she walked in. She said she felt this presence in the corner where the phone charger flew out of the wall. I told her what had happened. She didn't look much surprised. Then she said, "The boy's okay, he just wants attention, but whatever it is in your living room isn't good." And then she just walked away while I stood there in shock. The worst thing that had happened to me was, of course, when I was on the toilet. I was sitting there minding my own business, when from the other side of the door, I heard footsteps walk up to the bathroom. I could see the shadow of 2 feet from under the door, and I assumed my boyfriend had let himself in, since he was supposed to be picking me up any minute for dinner. The person on the other side was not making a sound, but just standing there, so I assumed the boyfriend was waiting to scare me when I came out. So I finished up, and still seeing the shadow, I said, "I see you, don't scare me," and swung the door open, fully expecting to see someone there. But nope, nothing. I was horrified and ran throughout the house, checking all the rooms thinking the roommate had come home. But when I checked the front door, and only door, it was locked and chained. No one had gotten in or out. I ran out the house and waited to be picked up on the front steps. The last thing that I'll mention is that one of my closest friends lived up the street, and when she was over, she clearly did not enjoy the feeling she'd get in my living rooms. One day she was over and we had plans to meet up later, so she went back to her place to shower and get ready. I told her I'd be over shortly, so after a half hour went by, I walked over and let myself in. I found her bug-eyed running around her apartment in a towel. When she saw me walk in, she started screaming, "That's not funny. How did you do that?" I had no idea what she was talking about, and she insisted I was just there, talking to her. She made me swear I wasn't lying, and then she explained what happened. While she was in the shower, she heard knocking on the bathroom door. She thought it was me, so she said, "Hold on, I'll be out in a minute." And to which she heard my voice respond with something along the lines of, "Come on, hurry up, get out of there, get out," and then more knocking. Thinking I was being annoying, she finished showering and came out, expecting me to be waiting at her house. When she realized I wasn't anywhere to be found, she began to panic, and that's when I walked in. Since I moved out of that apartment and back up north, I haven't experienced anything like this again. Hello everyone, Hollowkeez here. This compilation of stories was pretty fun to read, I must say. I should mention, the story about the Ghost Radar app sounds legit. I will admit, it's easy to be skeptical of them. I know I was. However, I did have my own experiences with it. On one occasion as I babysat my nephew, he was playing with Play-Doh which came in these little containers. Shortly before he was picked up, he put the dough back in their respective containers. But they were left scattered on the floor. For whatever reason, before I picked them up, I decided to run the Ghost Radar app. I kid you not, one of the first words I remember popping up was clay. Anyone who has ever used these apps knows that a relevant word never comes up using these things. There have been other experiences, but that's for another time. Anyway, this is my 10th video. I'm really happy I was able to stay somewhat consistent with my uploads, though not many are watching at the moment. It should get much easier as more people know I exist. For my 11th video, it will be something very different. You'll have to find out what it is in the next upload. I haven't even decided yet, as I have a few ideas. And with that, I hope you all have a nice day. If it's fear you're after, welcome home.